I'd like to welcome you to our last meeting of the New York Society for General Semantics of 2018. But we'll have
some mixed reaction.
I know. But we'll have many more for 2019. So happy holidays to everybody, and again, welcome. I'd like to point out, as I often do, that we bring these events to you for no charge, but we do encourage you to become members of the Institute of General Semantics, and that there are, in fact, pamphlets and pens. Free? Are they free, Jackie?
Yes, and bookmarks.
And bookmarks, so bookmarks.
And pamphlets.
And how much are they?
Free.
They're free.
And where
They're free.
Oh.
They are on the table in the back. So please help yourself to as many, or at least one. And of course, you can go online and at generalsemantics.org. You can, in fact, pay up your membership dues, which will entitle you to a subscription to the journal, etc., a review of General Semantics, which is as old as this organization, pretty much, going back to 46. We're also pleased to note that the Institute of General Semantics has started to make available the video recordings from our annual Alfred Korzybski Memorial Lecture, which I heard was okay. And from the symposium. So you can find that on the channel, the YouTube channel for the Institute of General Semantics. And of course, at our own New York Society for General Semantics website, you can find us, lots of resources. Please encourage others to come and check us out, and you can register there just on our contact list and stay in touch for future events. And so far we've been fortunate to have all of our events recorded and therefore viewable. Not always pretty, but certainly accessible in archival form. And that brings us to tonight's festivities. And our session tonight is has the title, What is Sanity? And have we lost it? And well, or maybe we should reverse that. It would be interesting to ask, have we lost it and what is it anyway? But I'll read to you the write-up just to get us started, get our feet wet. And we start with Alfred Korzybski, the founder of General Semantics. And he introduced General Semantics in his 1933 magnum opus with the title Science and Sanity. And so as the title indicates, general semantics is dedicated to the spread and enhancement of sanity, both individually and collectively. And as the title also indicates, Korzybski drew on the scientific method as the basis of his system, and he characterized that system as non-Aristotelian because he recognized the logical and the psychological problems that have been associated with long-standing forms of thought and language use. But what exactly is sanity? Or more appropriately, what does the word sanity refer to? How has it been used? How has it been misused? And I'll note that the root meaning is derived from the Latin, and it's associated with health. It's the same root from which we get the words sanitary, sanitize, and sanitation. And it has the same connotations as being of sound mind and body. By the way, sound in this instance has no connection to the acoustic meaning of sound. Well, I mean, actually, it's a case where similar sounding words were combined together rather than it having a direct connection. But it follows that sanity is associated with the concept of mental health. It's a health-based metaphor. But sanity is also closely associated with rationality and mental health, with adjustment to reality, especially for Korzybski. And we know in the judicial system, and yes, thank you, there are no lawyers involved in this session, but in the judicial system, sanity is associated with the ability to understand the consequences of our actions. But for Freud and his followers in the psychoanalytic tradition, and Fred may correct me on this, but sanity means being free or cured of mental illness. But others have viewed sanity as a social construct that varies from culture to culture rather than an objective phenomenon. And especially those of us of a certain age may remember Thomas, and no one knows how to pronounce his name, but Zatz. Zaz. S-Z-A-S-Z. You give it your own.
Hungarian.
Yeah, Hungarian. Yeah, that should be outlawed. But he famously argued that the concept of sanity is closely associated with social and political control in his 1961 book, The Myth of Mental Illness. So, while sanity as a label is most often applied to individuals, for Gregory Bateson and others who followed his cybernetic, systems-oriented approach, sanity resides in the relationship between individuals, including families and other groups. For Erich Fromm and others, entire societies may be diagnosed as sane or insane. And by extension, we could perhaps do it for the entire human race as a whole. So, in taking up the question of what is sanity, our panel will consider whether there is such a thing or phenomenon as sanity, whether it's possible to identify an objective form of thought and behavior that can be judged as sane. If so, how do we recognize it? Is it simply the absence of mental illness or emotional distress, or is there something positive, the positive presence of something more? Is sanity something we have, something we are, or something we do? Further, what's meant by the term sanity? I mean, how insanity, and how has it been used? What are the appropriate and inappropriate contexts for its use, and who uses the term? Who ought to use the term? What role does power, be it professional, institutional, political, or symbolic, play in the use of term? And by and large, are we as individuals in our contemporary culture still sane? What can we conclude about the relative sanity of the groups that we're a part of? Can a society be judged sane by definition or by diagnosis? Have there been societies in the past that have gone insane? Do we still have it, or have we lost it? And our panel will answer none of these questions.
That's for sure. Lance.
But who knows?
Who can follow Lance?
Who knows what they'll have to say? But let me introduce our esteemed panel, culled from the finest minds on the planet. On my far left, Nancy Collier is a psychotherapist, interfaith minister, author, public speaker, mindfulness teacher, and relationship coach. She's a longtime student of Eastern spirituality. Mindfulness practices form the ground of her work, and she's the author of several books, including The Power of Off, The Mindful Way to Stay Sane in a Virtual World. Could come in handy. Inviting a Monkey to Tea, Befriending Your Mind and Discovering Lasting Contentment. And Getting Out of Your Own Way, Unlocking Your True Performance Potential. She's also a regular blogger for Psychology Today and Huffington Post. To Nancy's right, in the middle, is Laurie Ramos, making her return to the New York Society's programming. Laurie earned her PhD in media ecology from New York University. Her early research and scholarship explored the role of media in shaping conceptions of and attitudes towards literacy. But more recently, her interests in communication have evolved to include psychotherapy. She received a Master's of Social Work from Fordham University. Yay. With a focus on clinical social work, and also completed EMDR training for trauma therapy. And she's currently an assistant professor of media studies at William Patterson University. That's in New Jersey for you New Yorkers. And a staff therapist at Blanton Peel Institute and Counseling Center here in the city. Finally, to my immediate left is Frederick J. What's the J stand for? Joseph? Frederick Joseph Wirtz, a professor of psychology at Fordham University and interim dean of Fordham College at Lincoln Center. He's also a fellow of the American Psychological Association and winner of the 2014 Rollo May Award for independent and outstanding pursuit of new frontiers in humanistic psychology by the APA Society for Humanistic Psychology. He's the co-author of 5 Ways of Doing Qualitative Analysis. He's the editor of The Humanistic Movement and co-editor of Advances in Qualitative Psychology and of Carl Jung in the Academy and Beyond, the Fordham Lectures of 1912. He's young at heart. And in case you missed that, I'm Lance Strait. I'm your host. I'm professor of communication and media studies at Fordham and president of the New York Society for General Semantics and trustee of the Institute of General Semantics. So, we will start with age before beauty. And Fred, I've asked our panelists to start us off by giving us a short sense, and we'll start with just the question of what is sanity and start talking about it on the individual level, and then whenever it seems right, we can move on to the larger question, have we lost it or someone? So Fred.
Well, how difficult to follow Lance's wonderful introduction, not to me, but to the whole question. What is sanity? And what a terrible question to have to answer. You know, I'll do a couple of things, one from philosophy and one from psychology, and then I really want to rely on my fellow panelists and the audience to get into all the complexities of Lance's questions. But maybe I'll start with, since what is sanity? Sanity is a predicate of the human being. Human beings are sane or not sane. And so the question of being and what is a human being comes into play. So I'm going to draw on Heidegger, who could arguably be called insane, to get a beat on being. from his great Being in Time, where he asked the question of being, tried to reawaken the question of being, and decided in approaching this to take some concrete example of being and what is closest to the question of being, the being of the questioner of being. And so what he immediately realized was that we call it the human being, that being the question's being for whom being is a question, or whose being is at issue for itself, is the whole problem of what a human being is. And so, we often think of people, a person is insane, or they're not sane, or they're sane, insane, like a property. Heidegger said, no, human beings are not like things, where like a chair is brown, or it's hard, or it is what it is. Human beings are those beings for whom their very being is a question. So the question of sanity is all of our questions. Are we sane? Are we insane? It's an issue for us. We're not sane the way a chair is a chair. So our sanity is always in question. And in that sense, I think I'd like to suggest a kind of an existential process, conception of sanity, where it's not given, it's always kind of maybe it's aspirational, maybe it's a challenge, but it's always a question, more than anything else. So I think, to have it as a question, have it as a challenge, have it as an issue, and that in that sense we could think we're insane, we could think we're sane, and meaningfully so, because it is a question for all of us, individually, culturally, collectively. But let me go to psychology to give you a little bit of an answer to one of the things that Lance asked about, the question of mental health and mental disorder, and whether health is more than the absence of mental disorder. And one of the psychologists that I like who addressed this question was a New Yorker who came from Brooklyn. And he's known as the father of humanistic psychology, and that would be Abraham Maslow. And he had a lifelong quest to understand what a healthy human being is. And it was deeply rooted in his own experience, because in his family, he had a very difficult childhood in Brooklyn. His mother and his father were, in his experience, absolutely horrendous. For instance, we know his theory of motivation, his theory of needs, and his basic idea is if people are hungry, give them food. Well, that came from a hard experience. His mother really, literally, kept a lock on the refrigerator. So he couldn't get food when he was hungry, and so he really experienced that suffering. He went out, he actually brought a stray cat home to take care of the cat, but he knew his father would disapprove, so he hid the cat in the basement and was feeding it, but his father found it. And his father drowned the cat in a big drum of water and killed it. And so Maslow spent his life looking for good people. He really, if he could find them and know what that was, he would have been very happy. He did consider it a kind of a personal avocation, and he actually inquired, and he loved people like Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict, and Eleanor Roosevelt. And he studied the people who he thought were magnificent, and he tried to understand what they were all about. He didn't consider it psychological research because for him he was educated in quantitative hypothesis testing and analysis, and so he very humbly viewed his research purely for personal reasons. But he actually carried it out, and he wrote it up, and he submitted it to all the major psychological journals, and every one of them rejected it because it was not scientific. Because he didn't use those methods. He observed people, he talked with them, he looked deeply within himself, and he came to certain conclusions. Well, fortunately, he happened to be, at that time, voted president of the American Psychological Association. So he gave the paper on the healthy personality as his presidential address. It was in the late 50s. And And so I'll tell you, what he thought a healthy person was. It's interesting. And basically, this is the essence of the healthy person. Now, the thing to understand about this from Maslow is that these things all interrelate. It's not just like a checklist. It's like, if you think deeply about each of these 18 characteristics, you'll realize that each one is implicit in every other one. So each one is implicit in the other 17. So you have to look at it as a whole, as a gestalt. And here I'll just run through them really quickly. They may come in useful for the discussion. So, and it's interesting the order he put them in too. I don't know anything about that, but I mean, I think he probably put or they couldn't be in the order. I'm curious if you'll think this might be the order of importance. I'm not sure about that at all. Okay, number 1, perception of reality. Perception of reality. Now, of course, what's that? What is reality? Well, it's healthy to perceive, keep seeing. Anyway, 2, acceptance. Acceptance of reality and acceptance of yourself. Deep acceptance of all your own experience and being in touch with your flow of ongoing experience and accepting it. Mindfulness. Problem-centered as opposed to ego-centered. There's a great emphasis on transcendence. This is not about you. That's what's interesting. Sanity, healthiness, is not about you. It's about everything beyond you, all the problems of the world. Not about you. You're caught up with yourself. That's not healthy. Why? Because reality is so much more than you. Okay. So solitude, the ability to be comfortable in solitude. Autonomy, the ability to act as a center of initiative of your own action. You are the author of your own actions and to be therefore responsible. To appreciate the world in a fresh way. These healthy people, he said, can have as much joy in a good cup of coffee or just the look of the sidewalk on the street as they do about anything else. The fresh appreciation of reality. Experiences that are exquisite, that are really stand out as incredible, wonderful, he called them peak experiences, that were ends in themselves and that were intrinsically meaningful and valuable. Human kinship. He said, the healthy person feels an inner kinship and alliance with all human beings. No matter what their station in life, no matter what their ethnicity or their race, feels one with them, a kinship with them, a familial feeling. And that also leads to humility and respect for others. Humility and respect for others. A deep interpersonal relationships, but not instrumental, not like using people to satisfy your needs. Recognizing the intrinsic value of other people and delving deeply into their being and valuing their being as a basis for deep relationships with others. He said oftentimes these people don't have a whole lot of friends. If they have one, it could be enough, or a few, but they rarely have that many deep relationships, and that's healthy. Ethics, a pervasive concern about ethics, always wondering, am I doing good, or aren't I doing good? And these questions plague the healthy person. To look at means as ends in themselves. So whenever you do something in order to achieve a goal, to look back at that and say, but is that good in it? Is that an end in itself? Non-aggressive sense of humor. He said sense of humor is absolutely essential to health, but not that kind of mean sense of humor where you're making fun of people or he said it's the kind that recognizing human limitations, recognizing how small we are, a kind of a cosmic sense of humor was healthy. Creativity, resistance to acculturation. So culture is not supreme. Healthy people question culture. They question the collective. They question social constructions. They're not buying into it necessarily. recognizing their own imperfections. Having a value system that's very, very problematic, but very important. Values and their own values are very important. And then the last one, which is actually my favorite, even if it may be last, is what he called the resolution of dichotomies. And so what did he mean by dichotomy? He said, oftentimes we think about people, and we look at them in terms of binaries, male, female, good, bad, or masculine, feminine, or
Democrat, Republican.
Democrat, Republican, or yes, exactly, Democrat, Republican, or like the head and the heart. There's your emotions, and then there's your intellect. He said that healthy people are unified. They're not one or the other. They resolve these dichotomies. They reject these binaries because they're in their own being. They cannot be categorized one way or the other. This was great. It was back in 1950s. So he was saying that females are masculine, men are feminine, and men need to own their femininity. Women need to own their masculinity. We all are both. We all have our intellects. We have our rationality, but we are emotions. So it's kind of like the complete person who actually owns and recognizes within themselves, all the differences that we recognize in people. And that was the last. I love that. And he listed many other binaries, many other dichotomies that he just said these people defy that kind of description. They can't be put in one way or the other. They're both. The both and. So I'll leave it at that.
Do you need all that for sanity?
But you have to remember Heidegger. It's aspirational. So sanity is always a process. None of us are sane the way a chair is brown or the way the chair is hard. We're not. We always question our sanity. And so in moments we may not be sane, in moments we may be sane. So these characteristics that Maslow gives us, you can't say, oh yeah, I've resolved my dichotomies. Yeah, right. If you think you've arrived, you haven't. Because it's a process. It's a process in which the being of your sanity is always in question, always questionable, always at issue.
Great, thank you. That's quite a launching pad,
Yes.
Laurie.
So let me see if I can follow you.
Well, I follow Lance.
So we have a challenge going. Okay. So actually I'll start backwards. First of all, I want to acknowledge something you said about the process-oriented approach to thinking about this question of what is sanity, right? So I want to begin there because I agree with that certainly, that we can't fix it. We can't say that sanity is fixed in any way, that we will always, this is what sanity will always be, right? Although I do appreciate all of those 18 points that put forth on Maslow, but I also appreciate in those 18 points that there is a flexibility in coming to terms with each of those ideas. In other words, for myself, key to understanding what is sanity is flexibility, right? And understanding that there's a process through which we can engage this discussion, that it's not fixed. And I also appreciate you beginning, with the sort of phenomenological approach as a question, as a dialogical question. What is sanity? Because I think that's a very sane way to perceive it, right? Which is a question. If we come at it with an answer, and that's a fixed answer, we're dead in the water. That's my take on it. And also, I come from a different background. I came to psychotherapy, I'm a psychotherapist as a second act in my life. So I began as a researcher, as an educator, and as Lance mentioned, I come from the ecological background, and my early research looked say that in that process, I really appreciated Freire's dialogical approach to talking about education as an ongoing process. In other words, it's not a, he was critical of this idea that it's a banking concept. In other words, we're depositing information into the minds of young people. And, you know, if you make enough deposits, you know, they graduate and they'll be, you know, successful, right, with this store of knowledge. And he was quite critical of that because he believed that what we needed to develop was a critical consciousness and to develop in young people the ability to question everything that they were being taught and to understand that everything they were being taught came from power systems, right, that had a stake in what was being taught. Now, I bring that up because, to me, this question of sanity, to some extent, is a social construct that I think is very much power-based. I think it's important to understand who gets to decide that someone is sane or isn't sane, and how that varies from culture to culture, right, and from situation to situation. And as Lance pointed out, although I'm, you know, certainly not a legal expert, you know, the definition of insanity, for example, has real ramifications in terms of someone's limitations on their freedom, on their lifestyle, right? So that we can't avoid, in my view, this concept of discussing this concept of sanity outside of a construct of power relations. And so that's why I bring in sort of my early educational research and background in understanding that, just as I did back then, talk about what is literacy, you know, and think about that within a construct of who gets to decide who's literate and what literacy is and what isn't. I bring that with me into psychotherapy and into the present when I talk about what is sane and what isn't sane and who gets to decide that particular construct. So one of the other things that Paulo Freire talked, a quote of his is, he said that language is never neutral, right? So therefore, if we start to use terms like insanity or sanity, you know, it's not neutral. They carry weight, they carry power, and they have ramifications. The other thing I will bring into this to sort of fast forward it to my life as a researcher and an academic. I recently wrote a book review for Explorations in Media Ecology from a book by Nora Bateson, who is Gregory Bateson's daughter, and she talks about systems theory. And one of the things that I really, really appreciated about her book, and I you know, just want to recommend it. I'll give a plug to Nora Bateson's book, is her talking about the very idea of, well, it's easier for me to just actually quote something that she wrote in her own words, and the book was Small Arcs of Larger Circles, Framing Through Patterns. And what she said in this, and let me see if I have it in the right spot. Yes, okay. Is she talked about the toxicity of conceptions of normalcy. In other words, if we start to think about normal as fixed, this can be very toxic, you know. And she wrote that she wants us to think about having the courage to shun a toxic normalcy that she perceived to be in our recent situation. And she said the way to do this, in my view, is really through a sort of flexibility, a willingness to be flexible within a system and to recognize that systems are always changing and cultures are always changing. definitions that we can rely upon. So she said, when I said before that language is never neutral, I'm quoting a section from Laurie Bateson's book, it's called a chapter, but a space in her book where she calls the title reckless, right? Because the very word reckless would suggest somebody who might have some insanity going on, right? They're reckless. They're not behaving according to norms. And she said the ecology of recklessness is alive with the courage to shun a toxic normalcy, to recognize a misalignment as success and success as misalignment. What does it mean to be healthy in an unhealthy system? Does sanity not require the madness to live otherwise? Another wise? So, for me, I can't help but talk about systems, even though you want us to focus on individuals
That's fine, okay.
first, because I don't see us living, boxes, right? We live in a world, in a context, and so, perhaps what some people would consider insane or reckless is actually a sane course of action for some in a world gone insane, right? So I guess I'll leave it there for now. That's sort of where
I just want to mention, though, that Nora Bateson was our guest here at a New York Society program, I think last year, and did a reading and conversation about her book, which you can find, again, on our website. You can find a recording of that if you're interested.
Why isn't it on the book then?
This is all.
It's new.
Oh, you mean,
But I would highly
Yeah.
recommend her talk. I've listened to it myself. I wasn't here, but I've listened to it on the website, and it's great, and the book is great.
And speaking of great,
Great.
Nancy.
Wow, there's nothing left.
Mm,
A lot has been said, and so I come at Sanity, I've been a therapist for a long time, but I come at Sanity more from a non-dual perspective, which is my spiritual practice. Similar to Buddhist practice, but a little bit different in certain ways. And from a non-dual spiritual perspective, sanity is made up. It's just a made-up concept. And it's also a construct of capital. And it is based really on a belief that we can figure things out. That if we understand things well enough, we'll find some sort of peace. We'll get to where we want to get to, and that there's a right way of being, and there's a wrong way of being, and it's really just another thought. It's just another idea. It has some truths to it. Like Fred was saying, there are aspects of it that may be applicable in certain cultures, but it's really a way of trying to pin down this human experience or this human being in a way that's not pin downable. There are ways in which, it's one way we look at it is we agree on a certain reality. That's a part of sanity, that we agree that this is true and this is not true and so on. And that's the paradox, which is we imagine that what we're looking at has anything to do with what anyone else is looking at. I mean, yes, maybe we all call that chair, but then when you actually get into someone's mind or their ideas, you realize that everything that you're experiencing has nothing to do with what they're experiencing, very often. So we pretend that we share a reality, but in fact we don't. Right? It's like there's one world, but there are billions of worlds. And so this idea of sanity is that somehow we agree on a shared truth or a shared reality, and that's totally false. And part of our insanity, from a non-dual perspective, is this total identification with the mind, a belief that we are this mind. We are our thoughts. We are our degrees and our, concepts and all of this, that defines us. And that we should believe these thoughts, that this out-of-order computer called the mind pelts us with all day long. There's some truth to them, inherent. And usually these thoughts will take us to a place of suffering at the end of the day. So built into sanity is some sense that this mind, which we point here, but actually we don't really know where it lives, is our savior, is our salvation, and we are it. So the beginning of sanity is realizing that where we're getting our information from is perhaps the wrong source. And that's sort of radical in this culture. But when you fundamentally distrust your own thoughts to some degree, not that they're not wonderful and delightful and full of some interesting stuff, but as some fundamental source of truth, that they are not to be trusted. So there's an insanity in that. There's also insanity in believing that we are in control, that we're in control, essentially. That we haven't surrendered to our complete and utter. It's not that we can take care of what's right in front of us, and then we have to surrender the results, that nothing else is in our control. We live inside a sort of insanity that we have a larger say in our existence. We live inside an insanity that is, we can make the inherently impermanent permanent, right? We're always in this endless chase to pin down anything to keep it from changing, to make our mortality somehow immortal. So our basic insanity is the rejection of reality, which is our impermanence. And from a Buddhist perspective, that is the cause of all of our suffering, is our inability to accept the impermanence of our own existence. So from that perspective, sanity is just another concept. It's just another thing to look at and find interesting or not, or how does that help us or not. And real sanity in spiritual practice, or at least spiritual practice I come out of, would be awareness, would be an awareness of our desperate need to call something sanity, our desperate need to create a norm, our ability to look at the contents of what's happening in the whole dialogue, but not be too tightly identified with any of it. That would be sanity. To not lock in any of it as some fundamental truth. And so that's sort of the perspective that I come from. And I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. I think, we do have some themes that, common themes that are surfacing about, kind of flexibility and relationships. So I'm wondering then, if we look at it from the point of view of therapy, when do we know that somebody needs it and that somebody doesn't need it anymore, which would go along with the traditional idea of perhaps lacking sanity in some way, and then what was from the mental health model being cured of their problems and therefore free to go, so to speak, and declared sane. So how do you tell if someone is in need of some form of sanity, someone's lacking it in some way, and that someone then has achieved that level and is not in need of any outside assistance?
I had a clinical supervisor when I was in psychotherapy training who said that the word cured should be reserved for good Kentucky hams.
Yes.
That's all I had
That's all
to
you
say.
Okay. So, I guess I will try to keep it brief also, and I would say that in my brief practice as a psychotherapist, I would say that if there is someone who is inflexible in their thinking and unable to consider alternative perspectives, unable to adapt to changing circumstances, this sort of technological approach is right there as well. In other words, adaptability, flexibility to live in the world. And if I, have met people who have struggled and suffered deeply because of their inability to change, be willing to consider the impermanence and the need for change, that perhaps the way they've always done things is not going to work anymore. Perhaps the way they survived some early trauma that worked at the time to survive that episode is not going to help them live a full life as an adult. And so that's where I would go with that.
So in my practice, I've been maybe almost 30 years seeing people, and I don't look at people as broken, no matter how they come in. I try and understand what reality looks like through their eyes, because I don't imagine that there's a right way of looking at it. So I come at it from a slightly, not a Western model at all, in terms of there's something to fix. The reason someone stays is because they're unhappy, if they're suffering, or if they feel that there's more to awaken to. And I absolutely do not see people who are all shades, all aromas, all incarnations of the human animal as heading towards some right way of being. But it's really about them falling in love with their own incarnation and helping them find a way to finding their tether into their own truth. And I don't see it as a fixing or a non-fixing. It's how awake are they to their own essence.
Yeah. I think, it seems to me that some of what you're saying is about that people come to you and say, I have a problem, can you help me? I'm wondering, what about the person who says there's nothing wrong with me, but there is? Yeah, that is, or at least others may say there is. And, it could range from the person who is, diagnostically, say, schizophrenic, or to someone who is engaged in kind of violent behavior, aggressive behavior, or someone who has a drug or alcohol abuse problem, but that, in other words, people from other than the individual is saying this person needs, has a problem, but the person himself or herself, more likely to be him, right? But is saying, I'm fine. There's nothing wrong with me.
But something is not working in their life.
But if they're saying I'm fine, it's working fine for me.
But if the people around them are saying this is not working,
So they're crazy.
so they're crazy.
Well, I'm just trying to play that
Yeah,
thought.
Yeah, good,
Right,
good.
no, it's good.
I do it very easily, you see.
Right, so what's it like to have everybody in your life think you're crazy? There's your entry.
It's their problem.
Well, it's tough, but, at least I'm not crazy.
Yeah.
That's the good news.
Enjoy your crazy, right? I mean, that's what, that is a complicated issue. It's a real thing when, you have somebody who's pathologically narcissistic or something like that, who blames, or borderline
Exactly,
person, who blames everyone. But somewhere in there, you'll find it's not working. It's usually not too far from the surface. And so that's your portal right there. They may live in denial, and sometimes you have to let a person go until they're ready to investigate.
So you would say they may have a concept that everything's fine in their life, and they may say everything's fine in their life, but if you really attend closely to their experience, you're going to find that it's not so good. And so as a therapist, that's what you do. You tune in to the person's experience and find those aspects, those moments when things aren't okay. And I guess if you can communicate that, reflect that back to that person, I guess your hope is that that would kind of prevail over whatever idea they have of themselves or whatever they want to tell you or say about themselves, and that somehow that realness of their experience that you've seen right in front of you will get through to them, and they'll start to own that. Is that your approach?
Sort of that, and then one asks oneself the question, or I ask myself the question, what is the larger goal in all this, right? So if I am ultimately looking to help them behave in a way where their life offers them more, because they're not alienating them, right? To what end am I doing that? If they're presenting to me as everything's fine, I would ask them, what are you doing with it? Right? So I have to ask the
What if they
question.
have to come, the court has mandated it?
That's a whole-
Exactly.
Well, I'm going to actually help Lance out a little bit on this,
Okay.
because I think, I absolutely appreciate what you're saying, and I'm thinking of a particular client that I myself have had in practice, where she really didn't see any problem at all with that she was hearing voices and was confident that the voices that she heard were negative about her, and that everyone was against her, and everyone was talking about her, and it was a real painful challenge to sit with her and be with her in her experience of what that was like, which I did try to do. But she would insist, as Lance would say, that there was not a problem. The problem was the stress caused by other people who were doing this to her. That was challenging for me, to sit with that when someone is saying to you, there is no problem, I don't have a problem, my problem is stress, calling it stress. everyone around me is talking about me, hates me, you know, racism, and all of these real things that probably do exist in the world, and I certainly wouldn't deny them, sexism, you know, that had been a part of her life. But when it overcame her ability to interact in the world at all,
Yeah.
you know, I think that's what this is sort of suggesting. What do you do in that? What do you do there? Is then we have to start to say, you know, something about sanity, perhaps, or how do we engage this as a problem? You know, I don't like looking at anyone that comes into my office as having problems. You know, and when I like to sort of explore, you know, what are the issues that are inhibiting them from having a more fulfilling life, and what would that fulfilling life look like, or how would it be? But if they keep pointing to someone else outside of themselves and they refuse to take medication that might stop this problem, then this is just an example, as I think what Lance is talking about. Right?
One thing, though, I think in regard to the question, and let's say we don't make it, let's get who's here, you know, people in the corners yelling at them. But if you take somebody who has a whole bunch of experience that we would technically say is, you know, off or wrong or something wrong with it. And from my experience in the chair, I have developed a really fundamental trust of not assuming I know something else, and buying into that truth, which is for them the truth, right? And trusting that if those contents, if all of that is allowed, it will find its own way, usually. And of course, with mental illness and, you know, someone's in a severe bipolar episode, this is not the case. But that most experience that's arising, if one doesn't try and fight it and say, you're not allowed, you need to be like this, and you ride with it, it will find its way to a place that's okay. And I have such a fundamental experience-based trust in that. I don't have to stand over here and say, no, you don't get a seat at the table, this experience. I have to educate you that it should be like this. Because who am I? Who am I to say that should be there or not should be there? If it's self-harming or something like this, it starts to be a different issue. But it's a humility of, what do I know, right? So what is this? What wisdom is inherent in this, and where does it lead together? But not from getting into an adversarial relationship with it.
Well, I did catch, though, you know, in all of what you're saying, that the possibility and in a sense almost the valorization of the individual who's willing to recognize that the world has gone mad, so to speak, you know, and that goes along with speaking truth to power and all of that. And yet, isn't that, you know, like, when do you know that the individual is sane and the context, the society, or the situation is insane, as opposed to this other possibility where the individual is in denial and not adjusted to the society? I mean, is it a matter of then being able to just be satisfied with your lot and well adjusted in your surroundings, or something else?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question. I think we can't answer it. But I'll tell you a story about one patient that I had. He was in a nursing home, very old. He was forced to see me because he was difficult to control, because he was throwing himself upon the women in the day room. He was suffering from dementia, in delirium much of the time, but he would try to make out with the women in their wheelchairs. And so they put a thing on his back, connected it to his wheelchair and his shirt, so that if he leaned forward, he went like that, and an alarm would go off. It was like jangle everybody's nerves in the whole place. I mean, it was just the most horrible thing that ever happened to anybody. But the reason why they sent him to me was that didn't stop him at all, because he didn't care about the sound. And so my task was, well, what's going on with him? What does he care about? Well, as he put it to me in one of his more lucid moments, he wanted to be married. And to him, being married meant, well, he was a guy who had lived with his parents all his life, had never had a girlfriend, or had never had any relationship with anybody of the opposite sex, He would have these dreams where ballerinas would be dancing down the hallway and sit in his lap, and he absolutely loved it. When he was washed by the aides in the shower, he would become aroused, and they would slap him and tell him, no, he'd tell them he wanted to marry them, and they'd tell him, you're too old, like that. You're not going to marry anybody. And he wanted to be married. Is what he thought. He wanted to really be close to someone. So. Well, he was struggling with this all the time, but nothing was stopping him. So, I couldn't, everybody realized it was inappropriate. The actual thing that precipitated his referral to me was that a woman who actually started to embrace him, and they were kissing, and they were having, to them, what seemed like a good time, but the trouble was that her husband walked in and saw this, and she thought he was her husband, and so she wasn't being unfaithful at all. She was making love to her husband, but that was not her husband. As far as the nursing staff, as far as the husband, who they recognized as the husband, did not recognize my guy as her husband. He was fine. He didn't care. He was like having a great time. But they could not allow this to go on anymore. So they sent him to me. So I saw him, in therapy, and I was working, with him, and I respected his sexuality, and I understood how much he wanted to make love to a woman, and but it was a tough situation, right? And the facility was very much against all that. Sex for people who are demented or who are in nursing homes, it's sort of not cool, not institutionally acceptable. So here we have a case of other people and their view, and what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, what's sane. He was insane. Now, I'm kind of with you. I'm with him. So I'm looking for allies in the system. A little systems thinking here. So, there was a very sweet social worker who was the director of social service, and I said, look, is there anybody in here who might like him? He's a cute guy, And, so she was thinking about it. And I came in one morning, and she told me he was dead. Oh. And I was heartbroken. I felt absolutely awful. It was just like, I was... And then she told me more of the story. She had been thinking about what I said, and there was a woman there she thought, could be kind of a good match with him. And so she introduced the two of them to each other. And sure enough, they really liked each other, and she wasn't married to anybody who was going to have a problem with this. And the woman liked him, and they were good. This was all in the period of a week. They ended up in her room for 4 hours or so. And at the end of the 4 hours, and she was fine, it was wonderful, but the trouble was they were both incontinent, so there were feces all over the room. It was a total mess. And they had an absolutely wonderful time, and he died at the end of it. That was it. He did that, and his life, as I interpret it, his life was complete. He had, talk about what's a person's purpose, what would fulfill their life, And I believe that for him, he experienced marriage, and his life was complete, and he didn't need to be around anymore. And she was actually, the woman was perfect. She wasn't disturbed by any of it. She was fine with all of it. And I felt like, wow, I'm really respecting that social worker for having the courage to go against the institution. And to make an arrangement where people could really satisfy themselves in ways that weren't hurting anybody, mutually consenting seniors, and and I thought that was wonderful, so.
I think it's such a beautiful story, and I love that idea of, what is this human being's purpose, and without, putting interpretation on it or judgment, and just seeing if you can facilitate. And that's the simplicity, so much. It made me think of another sort of inherent insanity in our culture from a non-dual perspective is this idea that we are lacking something. Right? I'm thinking of his belief that he needed that to somehow, which we honor, and but that we come up and we're sort of brought up to believe that we inherently lack something for our completeness. So we accomplish everything, we do everything, we go out, and we get all this searching and striving, and then we find that we feel just as sort of incomplete as we ever did, and that a basic level of sanity from a spiritual perspective is realizing what it means to be whole, what it is to find your inherent worth that is not dependent upon what we acquire, if you will. But when you said that it was what his purpose was, that was his completion. And I'm glad that you facilitated.
Like it.
Yeah.
I give that social worker so much credit. I thought it was a real, beautiful thing she did. And it took courage too, because in this institution, it was really, she was going against the rules by doing that.
And sometimes, as a therapist, it's funny because you're taught, don't get involved in this way, or don't get involved in that way. And after you've been in practice for long enough time, you think more like a human being. You think, can I help this person in some fundamental way? It's easy.
Absolutely.
Right? It's more about kindness than it is about, do it this way. And that you spoke to them and then, made that happen. It just becomes much simpler. Will this help this person? And you can get involved in a more personal way, although it's not without, very clear boundaries. But you can also be a human being.
Yeah, I would share a story. Actually, I love the story. I think what I like about it is how you were able to ally with a person and recognize this very real need of his that was real and necessary for him. But it reminded me, first of all, how the truth of at least in my grief experience doing what I'm doing as a therapist, people are suffering. People suffer greatly, and that's true. And to be witness, to bear witness, and be with them in that suffering is important and necessary, and also to recognize what is true for them, even if there is not some truth in an objective sense. So I'm thinking of something my husband had shared with me once that I've seen play out in my own recent clinical experience, but he shared with me when if you don't mind my sharing when
My grandmother?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
I want credit in the paper.
Okay. So, when his grandmother was aging, she was beginning to feel some paranoia about people taking things from them and taking things from her and stealing things that weren't being stolen, not recognizing people in her home and feeling really threatened. And Ed shared with me that a friend at the time who was recognized that earlier on in her life experience and held that truth with her, which I tried to do, but she was at the point where it wouldn't, she didn't trust me, she didn't trust anybody to do that anymore. And so that was very sad for me. And she felt threatened and had reasons to feel threatened based on her past experience. But in the present, the things that she was experiencing weren't really going to kill her. Although they might have, I don't know, because she left.
One thing too that makes me think of is when you're talking about the truth of a client and finding what is that metaphor for? What is the necklace really representing? But it's also interesting and kind of tricky when you work with somebody who's had a lot of trauma and they have a truth in their amygdala, they have a truth in their nervous system, and then that truth doesn't match the truth in their mind, what they know. So the body gets triggered by something that reminds their nervous system of an earlier trauma, and the body is actually living something fully. It's the body's truth that the mind knows is not the current threat. And
Or doesn't know.
or doesn't know. Sometimes it can, sometimes doesn't know. But helping people sort of make that line between everything right now is telling me that I can die, right? And yet there's an awareness that that's not true. And then there's a larger awareness which can witness that whole duality all at once. So it's really when somebody can build that kind of awareness of my body is in emergency, my mind knows that's not true, and I see all of that, then you have freedom. And it's very tricky with the nervous system because the flooding of all of the fight or flight hormones and the danger signals can kidnap the mind, and then prevent any larger awareness from happening. But it's a very interesting process when all that's happening.
Maybe we'll switch gears a little bit. And Fred brought up at the beginning, one of the 18 was question culture. What if that makes you kind of out of step with your culture? I was also thinking because, Laurie mentioned literacy. Over a decade ago, I was at a conference about Walter On. On's area was orality and literacy. And so one of the speakers they had was a psychoanalyst. And he just, and the whole point of his talk was about talking, and talking being therapeutic. So I asked him, but can you psychoanalyze somebody who's from an oral culture, that is, a kind of tribal culture where people are not literate? And he really didn't have an answer for that. His answer was sort of like, maybe I could, I don't know. It seems to me that this also brings to mind the Eastern culture, kind of question, because so much of psychotherapy is based on the individual, which we associate with literacy, Western culture, and so are you happy, are you well adjusted again? But in Eastern cultures, there's a much stronger sense of the group. So I think that behavior that would be judged inappropriate, say in India or Japan or China, would be considered good behavior, standing up to authority in Western nations. So how do we judge that, or how do we evaluate that in terms of, again, our question of sanity? Is it what's appropriate for the culture, or can we say that the individual supersedes our culture. And Nancy, I'm particularly interested in your view because you bring into an Eastern approach into your work.
Well, I guess I would wonder what would be the dilemma. So somebody is here from India, and they are behaving in a way that is of the Indian culture, right? I mean, what's interesting is, in Hinduism, the goal of life, right, is to realize oneself as God. That's the goal of life. It's not to achieve. So you have to look at what's the culture, but also what is the purpose seen as.
Speak a little louder, please.
Sure. What is the purpose of life? So when you say how would we evaluate that, if somebody from India is behaving in a way that fits their culture, but what would be the problem that you would imagine that?
I'll give you the classic sitcom scenario. A young person from India comes to America and falls in love with a young American boy, it's usually a young woman, and has a dilemma because she is her parents have her arranged to be married to someone back home who she hasn't even met and certainly doesn't love. By the standards of the traditional culture, this is the appropriate thing to do, is to go ahead with the arranged marriage. But of course, in typical American sitcoms, they usually have her defying her parents and following the course of true love or romantic love, that kind of plot line.
And so the question would be, which is the insanity, or what is the insanity? Well, to me, it seems like there would be some room to have, not pick a side, this is right or this is wrong, but rather some sort of awareness of, in your culture, it's done this way, and this is the key, it's and not but. So, and you've fallen in love with this boy here. So your culture would say this is a should, this culture says this is a should, and then where is room for what do you want? What do you want? Right? But that they're not saying, oh, this is the sane side, this is the insane side, but to lay out all of that, all of life results in a contradiction, right? So all of that is true, and now if you pick this path, there will be challenges and there will be hardships. If you pick this path, there isn't a right anything. So we throw out that idea, and that to me would be sanity there, which is to say all of this is happening, and using the capacity you have with this conditioning and this new culture, what are the challenges? Where is your growing edge? Is your
So
growing
both
edge?
are possible, and both are possible for you. And as a therapist, you wouldn't push a person one way or the other.
How would I know? What challenge?
It's an existential question for them, and you'll help them explore the meaning of those paths and what would be right for them, but you wouldn't push them one way or the other.
Although, I like to help out my. And again, also, I'm remembering, Nora Bateson talked about this, maybe in the talk or in her book, where she was at a conference somewhere in Asia, and it was a family systems event, psychotherapy group, psychoanalytic conference, right? And this therapist, and I forget, I'm sorry, where in Asia the therapist was from, but he was presenting this case study of what he was very proud of how he had done a great job with this couple from his culture. And the issue, as Nora Bateson described it, is she was sitting in this conference listening to this marriage counselor talk about what a great job he did, and as she heard it, it sounded like the woman had been essentially raped by her husband all these years and didn't want to have sex with him anymore, marriage counselor helped her accept that she should have sex with him because in her culture, that's what she should do. In the culture of being married.
He
you know.
took sides.
So he took sides in his, but what was really interesting about this was the complexity of how she looked at it from all sides, because she talked about herself as a Westerner sitting there thinking, how could she take sides, how could he take sides in this, and, this is not right, and this woman has been essentially raped all these years by her husband and forced to have sex, and then she had this ability to somehow sort of step outside of it and realize that within that culture, he was trying to help this woman reconcile how to live her life and her marriage in this culture with this set of values somehow, where that was deemed normal. And she was being deemed insane because she didn't want to have sex with her husband anymore. So I just thought that was really interesting.
I feel like that, this is just my own bias, but every time I see a woman in a burqa, I think that's sanity in that culture. And just her eyes show. And I have that feeling every time I see it. But for me, this feeling, obviously, the same, and yet it has nothing to do with your experience.
So I just thought of that example when you were talking about that as opposed to the sitcom example.
Right.
This is a very real example, where maybe for that culture, I don't know, do you find a way to help this woman live in this system where she otherwise has no way of living on her own? Unlike here, where she might have a way to escape or do something else or leave her husband.
And she may have presented it to that therapist as, this is a problem because of this. So it wasn't that the States or some other culture was an option.
She just didn't want to have sex with her husband anymore, and when it evolved, why? That was the circumstance.
Well, let me give a different example then, or a different point. I'll mention when I was I think it must be at the 70s, because I believe I was an undergraduate when I just picked up this book. It was called The Radical Therapist. And it was put together by Jerome Agel. I didn't realize at the time or know who that was, but folks in media ecology may know his name because he's the person who put together The Medium is the Massage and War and Peace in the Global Village. And he also did one for Buckminster Fuller, I Seem to Be a Verb, and many other kind of experimental books. And a book on 2001, back when Cooper came out with it. But this was a book, and the basic argument was that therapists are part of the system, right? I mean, this goes along with Paulo Freire and the point on liberation, that what therapists do is somebody comes to them with legitimate problems that have to do with their social situation, and the therapist makes the person well-adjusted, makes them feel better. I mean, it's similar to this example of the woman being raped, making her feel that, be able to accept her situation.
Normalization.
Yeah, and that is what happens, like in, say, corporations have people, big corporations have people hired that's their job, is to make people well-adjusted within that setting. And it kind of fits in with Jacques Ellul's view of the technological society, that it's all about making people adjusted to live into these social conditions. And the argument in The Radical Therapist is that the therapist ought not to be doing this, because this is just helping to perpetuate the problems and serve the system. You can't be a good therapist unless you work on the level of society and try to change society. And perhaps following Paulo Freire, even the effort to do so is helping the person, even if they're not completely successful.
And with that, the job of the therapist is to help people want, not their should. So the should is all about the rules, right? But if you can get at what is the want underneath it, is there still a primal want? Is there still something left of the being that hasn't been kidnapped by what we should be? Is to see if you can find that. And it is possible. That's the good news. It is possible. There's an ember of authenticity and of something that the system didn't create.
I like it. I like it because I do love polytheory and I love the idea that we're really needing to work with individuals who are living within a system that is also often coercive and has all these isms and how can we help a person live within that system but find their own truth and find their own, and sometimes it means political action, action, social action.
So you see therapy as socially liberating.
Yes, I would say ideally I fall in that framework.
Yeah, and actually part of it too was that it was not enough to just deal with the individual, but to keep track of all the individuals, because if everyone's coming up, take sexual harassment, right?
Yeah.
If you got one person after another coming up complaining of sexual harassment, and each time the person helps that person therapeutically to adjust to the situation, or in whatever way, then there's never any point where they say there's a problem in the system, in the organization.
Yeah, I do see that.
What do you think, Fred? Are you going to be radicalized?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. I mean, the idea of a therapist as being a sort of an agent of the state, almost like a policeman or some kind of colonial administrator, is a horror. I mean, I would never do that. I wouldn't. I'd find another profession if that was what it was all about, right? I mean, we wouldn't want to do that. None of the three of us would be interested in that kind of work, right?
Then you're just a widget, maybe. You just could be anything. Yeah.
But I would take it further and say that it's beyond the individual. I would say that the individual is part of the system.
But the system changes too. I mean, we know from our own culture that culture is not static. So the whole idea that the culture is somehow this thing, is not true either. Cultures are there's a process in culture too. And so, of course, there are so-called traditional cultures that don't change as much as ours has historically.
So what would you do with an Indian woman? How would you deal with that Indian woman who's dealing with very real problems for her?
It's a great question. I don't know if we're up to questions.
Go ahead. Go. I mean,
Yeah.
we weren't, but George butt in. So.
Well, I said I would let's lay out what's true, right? We have this is the conditioning, this is the opportunity, and then help that individual woman look at what is of interest to her, if you will, in the challenge that bucking with her culture, her conditioning will offer her, and what are the fears in that, blah, 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 and the same on this side. And try and with all the awareness that we have, right, ask also in her body. Because very often if we're asking here, we get one set of answers, but if we ask actually in her body has an answer that it wants.
Would you privilege the answer of the body over the other answers that you might find in other areas of her experience, or not?
I don't get privilege.
Okay.
Right? So if the body's
But you take the body seriously,
I
but
sure
not
do,
as
yeah.
the most important thing, or?
So the body might awaken to, God, I really want to marry this guy I love. Right? That is my absolute.
And would that be the bottom line then for
I
you?
don't
Or
know.
you're
And
not
then-
sure?
No, and then we would bring in what does the mind say? My parents not talking to me for the
Yeah, what about that?
Really
What
bad.
about
And
that?
I would take it, to your question, a third option, which is, there's what I want, there's what my culture wants, and then there's what I might choose to do, knowing that there's repercussions for my choices, to engage my culture in transformational change, and or find a way to gain support from others in my culture to do what I want to do. Because clearly her
But what
body
if
was.
she's like, I'm not Gandhi, I
No,
just
no,
want to make
you
a
don't have
decision
to.
about
You don't
my
have to be Gandhi.
marriage.
You don't have to be Gandhi. But I think it's important to say to the person, clearly she's telling her therapist what it feels like in her body. She feels raped. She feels oppressed. That's what her body is telling her.
It's two different cases, but
It's the same
similar
principle.
issue.
That's what she's feeling. That's the issue I thought you were talking about. Is that
The
the
one who
case?
she's gonna marry.
Yeah.
The Indian.
Is that the one you were talking about?
No, you guys don't know that.
No, he
I
was
was
speaking
talking
to
about
the
the
one,
Indian woman.
he was speaking to the issue that
Right.
I'm addressing now, yes?
Right.
That's not an Indian woman.
That's not the Indian woman, that's the woman who doesn't want to accept anymore.
Right, but I understood.
It doesn't, but the point is the same though. I mean, do you direct, do you help that person to try to
Don't
change?
direct. I
Or
don't
do
think
You don't direct, you
You
don't
don't
direct.
You
No.
find the wisdom, and I think what Laurie's saying is very accurate too. Is there another option about working in the system so that there's
Yeah.
change? But your job as a therapist is to trust a larger wisdom will come through if all of it is laid out in front of you without any judgment about what is allowed to see to
What the
change.
choice becomes, what the choice is hers.
What if in her culture they don't have a concept of marital rape and you do? Right, this is a standard question of feminism. What if you on the West have these concepts and they don't? Are you then going to have a judgment at all in this?
Well, that's what she was struggling with. and
Well, what
that's-
if she wasn't saying she was raped? I think that was your language. The
No,
language
no, it was
Yeah.
the language that she described, the essence of what her therapist sort of conveyed to the group at the psychotherapy conference.
Right, so we don't know it was the patient's language, because the patient might not have the concept of marital rape. Just for the sake of argument, let's say the patient doesn't have a concept of marital rape and you do. Are you now going to enter in with a judgment, or are you going to say, I'm not going to inform them that in the West we think that's rape? I'm giving you a hypothetical. But,
Yeah, I wouldn't do the judgment thing. I think I'm with you, and I can be criticized for that. I realize that's a possibly flawed, approach. I remember I saw a documentary once that I had what to me was a pretty interesting experience about this documentary. I can't remember that much about it, but it was a documentary on domestic violence. And the part of it that really struck me was it was a woman who was black, and her husband beat her. And they, it was the standard thing, like, you gotta get out of this marriage, we're gonna give you support, you gotta get to a homeless shelter or wherever, and get out. This is the healthy thing to do. The woman refused to do that. And she gave what, to me, was a brilliant sociological analysis, but it was more than that. It was a compassionate witnessing of her husband's life and her understanding that he was being crushed in every moment almost of his life. And he was supporting the family and supporting her and supporting their kids, and that he was really suffering so badly. She was the only person who didn't have as much, he had less power than everybody except her. And, I can't express in words what her resolution to stay with her husband meant to her, because it was to me, it was a noble act of self-sacrifice and love, because she understood that if she carried the burden of his violence, the family was okay, he was okay, and she's okay with it. This is what people had so much trouble understanding. Everyone in this documentary wanted her out of the marriage, and she hung in there, and she was staying with him. And she actually experienced herself as strong and resilient because she could take it, and she could love him. she could love that man, and she did love him, and I didn't doubt that she loved him. And she hung in there loving him, and that was her choice. And it was a bad society, it was a sick society, it was a pretty bad husband, you know? Although he loved her too, and she saw that. And all this was in her experience. You would have explored it. And you wouldn't have told her to get out of that marriage, you know? And, you know, from what I sense, you would have respected her experience to stay in that marriage. Everybody who made the documentary was, she's crazy. She's insane.
But there's a third option, and I'm going
Yeah,
to
and would
hold
you
to
give
it.
her another option and
I would.
think
I
that
would
that might
say
be better for her?
I would absolutely take her experience and I think it's valid that and
There's a
it's
but
true.
coming.
Those that are oppressed,
There's a but
those that are oppressed have often been oppressed, and there's a history to oppression and violence, and absolutely that she has empathy for him, I think is incredible and amazing. And would I acknowledge that and give value to that? Absolutely.
But?
Would I encourage her to actually encourage him to consider getting help, coming together to figure out a way to deal with his oppression, to deal with what his pain is that's causing this to occur? Would I take that as a possible third option and throw it out there? Yes. Would I respect if ultimately she chose, no, I want to stay, I don't want to do that, that's her choice, and I would absolutely respect it. But to Lance's question, is there an opportunity in therapy, in my personal view, to bring in the larger structures and institutions as a way to be both supportive and engaging? Yeah, I see a lot of couples now that I didn't originally see. I saw people come in as individuals, and I thought, this is a systems problem. You know, this is a problem where maybe we should all be talking about this together. And therefore, it becomes a new way to engage a larger system.
Yeah, and I'm going to piggyback on that too. I think there's certainly nothing wrong with putting out, you know, this might be a possibility, but also being very mindful of not getting attached to our suggestion. Exactly. So, you know, we put it into the landscape that this could be an option, and then you follow what their
reaction to that, or
yeah.
how that seems to them.
Exactly. It's not my view versus your view. It's I can bring an option that you may not be aware of, and then see. Yeah.
I'm just curious how you would feel to hear that, and the woman was murdered the next week.
Personally,
Yep,
myself?
I'm just curious.
Well, gee, that's a big question. I don't know.
Because you encouraged her to stay in your situation and talk to the husband.
You're saying encourage her to stay. So now you're the boss, you're the expert.
No, I'm just
encouraging her to
asking,
stay.
as opposed to
What
being.
we were saying is, no, you don't take a position like that.
Wait, the situation is she's being beat up by her husband. That's the situation. I'm asking how you feel if you encourage, if you lay out all these options and you don't really try to get her to the homeless shelter, or you don't report to the police or whatever, and you honor her love, and she's murdered by the husband that week.
Yeah.
I don't care whose question it is.
You know,
who's
I'll
answering.
just tell you about William James. Beautiful book if you haven't read it, Varieties of Religious Experience. So, you know, he gets deeply into religious experience. And to make a long story short, he thinks that it's really about a feeling, not a belief in God or anything else. It's a feeling. Feeling is love. The feeling is that love is the answer. And that's the bottom line. And its ultimate connection with love is the way. So, I mean, so then he says the value of religious experience. He's interested, because he's a pragmatist, and, you know, if you adopt that perspective radically, what are the chances? You know, is that really going to work? And he uses Nietzsche, who says, no, it's not going to work. In a world of beings with claws and talons and aggression, and, you know, the person who loves, the person who believes in love as the ultimate goodness and refuses any other way, you know, it's just They're going to die, like this woman would have, you know. And James struggles with that mightily. And you know, in the end, though, he says, that's the martyr, and the martyr is dying, but there's a nobility to dying and pointing in the direction that is the only direction for human beings, even if it's at the cost of your life.
I still didn't hear an answer.
No, if she dies for love, it's better than anything else you could die.
No, I want to go, I'd
No, but
like
wait
to
a-
address that.
Okay, please.
And I'll address your question.
And hold off a second.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Bridget?
So I think this is a really general question, but, well, that was a very specific instance of my general question, which is essentially, well, this goes along with that particular issue. If you're saying sanity is like a social construct, which I know a couple of you have agreed with, then how can you justify therapy being socially constructing? And so, like, if you're against living in a box and you're a therapist, like, how can you justify that, knowing that sanity itself is a social construct? Because I feel like that's just a particular of that instance. And so in the more general sense, like, how do you justify knowing that it's a social construct, essentially that therapy is socially constructing in itself?
Well, I think what we're talking about is a form of therapy that's not a box, right? So throwing out the box, and that it is a construct of sanity. And so what you're trying to actually get at is what's underneath the construct of
So
persistence.
with that, I know that you said some of our thoughts come from the wrong source, but my question to you is, what would be the right source, and how would we get to our own incarnation? And from there, once we know our own incarnation, learn to love it. You said we have to fall in love with our own incarnation. How do we get there, and how do we learn to love it?
I'm going to double back just for a second to the question behind me, because I think they're related.
I do too.
But also, if that woman, and this is, you know, again, we're talking in big theory here, but if that woman, before she was murdered, if she had one moment of having somebody hear her and listen to her and just welcome whatever the hell was there for her, okay,
She did.
she did.
Oh, she
That's what
did.
I'm saying.
And guess who the person was, among others? Her husband.
Right. So I would say I would join that, and I'm a Jamesian too, in the sense of that was a life pursuit. And did it end in the way that, and I know it's radical to say that, but maybe that was for her what needed to happen. The idea that we are the masters of the universe and can say the way it's supposed to go, you can be there and you can be loving and you can, you know, sit with what is, and I think that's our only job, really. And then where it goes, that's not in
You
our
don't even know. You don't know. You don't know where it should go.
That's right. And taking away any sort of grandiosity that I know the way it's supposed to go out. I know what I can offer. I know it's not what our system teaches. But I would say that is
You don't know that a husband shouldn't beat a woman, or that people in general shouldn't beat up other people? You don't know that?
No, I don't know that.
Okay,
I
okay.
don't know
Okay.
it.
It's hard to believe.
Yeah, we have a disagreement.
We have a document.
We have a disagreement.
I do. I have my value system says, no, I will have to let this woman know that there were alternatives to being.
You're telling her there are better ways that you
I
know
don't
that
know.
are better than the way
No,
she's
I'm
living.
saying there are alternatives. There are
That's
alternatives for
just so
ways.
much language to say that you know
I-
better than she
Fred?
does.
I see people who do choose to be abused and abuse themselves. I don't say that I can intervene in that. All I can do is propose that there were alternative worlds possible. Yeah, and I will stand by my intervening. I absolutely will. I'm not a passive therapist in any sense.
what is habitual? Culture is often habitual. What is inherent to them personally? This is a very American idea, right? And what is habitual? They just do it because that's how they've been brought up. And number two, have you ever, any of you, heard of the work of George Gurdjieff? That P.L. Travers, who wrote Mary Poppins, and Catherine, famous writer, a lot of writers followed him. His work was esoteric Christianity, which you all have expressed in some way, and so is Marshall McLuhan. Do you understand this work? But my first question, do you ask them, do they know what is inherent in themselves? It's asking them, it's not putting anything on them, versus what is habitual. Because a lot of your questions or their problems deal with not understanding that, well, this is how I feel and this is how my culture is. What's inherent is what's in you, we would say, in our individualistic society. But what's habitual is something that we all do because it's a habit. And as we're brought up, we come to realize, my parents told me all this stuff about me. That's habitual, I've learned. But what's inherent in me might be something else. And for them to discover that, Nancy and Laura and Fred, might actually help them through these very difficult questions.
I totally agree with that. That's what I'm trying to do, is to see what's inherent in the person all the time, and to recognize what may
Coming
be...
from our own culture.
Well, no, coming from themselves, because what comes from our culture would be those habitual learnings that I'm not as interested. I'm interested in all of it, but I'm definitely interested, maybe most of all, there's my bias, in what's inherent.
And how do I know what I know? How do I
But
know
ask
what I know?
them. Explain what inherent
That's what
is
we
But
and
the
what
trouble
do they
is, if you
feel
ask
about
them, they may not be able to tell you, because if you ask them, they'll intellectualize, they'll give you so many words. You need to see, you need to perceive, you need to feel, you need to listen really deeply, and stay with them, and be their witness, and try to find what's inherent in them. And you do ask them. I think, Carl Rogers was wonderful, because we always try to see rather than think about what is going on with his clients. And when he saw what was going on, he would say it honestly, as well as he possibly could, and then he put a little interrogative lilt at the end of it. Is that it? Turning it back over to them to say, yes, that resonates with me, or no, it's not quite like that, or yeah, but it's also, and then he would follow them, not insist, well, wait a minute, I think what I said was right. No, because he's looking for inherence, just as you suggested. I think that's very, very important.
And then the biggest
No,
obstacle,
okay,
the biggest obstacle to inherence, I will tell you, is the mind. It's the mind. The construct, you have to work diligently and radically to get out of the ideas about what is inherent before you can get into anything real. And this is the primary work, is releasing the belief in that.
Now, we only have a little time left, so I want to get into, we really just have a few minutes to deal with that final question. And we've really kind of moved into it in a sense of, can we judge a collective to be insane or sane, and bring that up to the level of a society? And, they say eventually everything, someone brings up Nazi Germany. I'll just point out that Fred started out with Heidegger.
A Nazi. A Nazi.
So I feel no guilt about bringing it up. Was that an insane society that turned insane? Speaking spiritually, and if you look at the book of Genesis in particular, there is a tremendous polemic against groups of nations in that area that practice child sacrifice. There's an abhorrence of these cults that sacrifice children to their gods. Is that insane? And ultimately, can we evaluate our own culture? And if so, what would you say about America today? Since you're Heideggerian, Fred, I imagine you're going to say
Well,
that
Trump is
the
insane.
Nazis were,
No.
were okay, right?
No, I think we have to. We have to evaluate culture. And culture can be evil, culture can be bad, and I think it's very noble to try to change culture, to make it more humane, to make it more good, and sometimes that means war. I believe just war is a possibility, but I think it's very difficult to know when a war is just, and I think these questions are very, very difficult to be sure about. We could be wrong all the time, but I think absolutely necessary to criticize culture, to liberate people from the shackles of culture, and to change culture. Absolutely crucial, important. And of course, I'm an American, and I'm a Westerner, and I believe that change can be good and all that. And so, I think we're in a place now where we're no longer living in traditional cultures where we rely on traditions only. But, we respect traditions, but we can also recognize that they need to be changed. And I think in that sense I'm rather modern.
And have we lost it?
In many ways, but we've also gained it. I mean, look at civil rights and look at, the race problem. I mean, we've lost it. It's horrible. Is it as horrible as it's always been? In some ways, yeah. In other ways, no. So, ambiguity, I think, has to be acknowledged. And I think, and the ambiguity of culture and its goodness and its badness is hard to say, it's one way. So that's my answer.
To me, I would say the insanity of Nazi Germany, or perhaps to some extent our own culture at this time, is a group thing. Is this idea that we have to circumscribe to one perspective or another, the binaries that you were beginning to talk about. You're with us or you're without us, you're in or you're out.
Us and them.
Us and them. This, to me, is insanity, right? Because it is a binary. We live in a more complex, ambiguous world. And so, if we are living in a time, which I think we are, where this is the case, in many places around the world, then sadly, we're not living in a healthy system. We're living in a system that needs mending, healing.
I join you completely that we're living in an insane time in this culture, in that there's a right and wrong, an in and an out, and it leaves no room for everything resolving in contradiction. It's a but world when it really is an and world. We shut the door on that. I think absolutely there is a place for cultural change for the better.
We've talked about buts and ands, and I had a friend who told me something that I've always remembered, and I've tried it out, and so I'll share it with you too. You might just try this. This is what she said to me. Eliminate but from your vocabulary, but not just don't say the word. Don't ever even think that way. It's always and, always and, always and. If you ever feel yourself like working your way up to a but, back away and make it an and. Make it always and, always and. Who started it?
S.
Is that right? Is that from S? Is that from S?
Yes.
No, we don't like S. But it's hard. It's hard. It's like a new discipline. Try it. It's a new discipline. Just try it out. Try it out. No, I'm not promoting S. But just try the and. Try to replace ands with buts and just see what it does to your head. It's very interesting. Everything. It's interesting to just see what it's like to do that. Just try to do it for a few weeks. See what it's like.
This is actually very much in keeping with general semantics, where we do things like add etc. at the end of sentences, and there was a whole effort to eliminate the verb to be from the, at least from written English. It's very hard to do it in spoken English, but to write without any use of the verb to be, because Korzybski saw at least some uses of is, and others went further with that, but uses of the word is as creating problems in our thinking about the world. I'm sorry, I know that a lot of you want to keep talking, but we are actually past the time, so we're going to say thank you to our esteemed panelists for really a wonderful discussion. Our next session will be in January. Our first session of 2019 will be on a Friday. January 18th, I believe, is the date. And we'll have some out-of-towners in town to talk about the state of the semantic environment. So join us then. Thank you all for coming.